Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to my respected lecturer Dr. Hairul Nizam bin Hashim and to all my fellow friends. Today we are going to present about the financial crisis in Russia, Mexico and Argentina. I would like to introduce our group members Najwa binti Muhammad Radi, Mani Shazwani binti Qadir, Nur Azlin binti Isa, Nur Fatimi binti Abdul Aziz, Nurul Izzati binti Muhammad Hazim, Nurana Dalini binti Rashidi and last Tengku Nur Syafiqah binti Tengku Marzuki. Now I would like to pass to our first presenter, Mani Shazwani, to present. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to my respected lecturer Dr. Hairul Nizam bin Hashim and to all my fellow friends. Today we are going to present about the financial crisis in Russia, Mexico and Argentina. I would like to introduce our group members Najwa binti Muhammad Radi, Mani Shazwani binti Qadir, Nur Azlin binti Isa, Nur Fatimi binti Abdul Aziz, Nurul Izzati binti Muhammad Hazim, Nurana Dalini binti Rashidi and last Tengku Nur Syafiqah binti Tengku Marzuki. Now I would like to pass to our first presenter, Mani Shazwani, to present.
Hi, Assalamualaikum everyone and Sir Hairul Nizam. My name is Marin Shazwani binti Walid and I will start our presentation today about Russian financial crisis 2014. Okay, so let's start with the background of the financial crisis in Russia 2014. In the 2000s, Russia benefited from rising oil prices, but it was hit hard by the global financial crisis in 2008 until 2009. Russia's economy sharply contracted by 7.8% in 2009. Growth rebounded in 2010 but has been falling in subsequent years. Economic pressures in Russia have been building, marked by capital flight, steady depreciation of the ruble, inflation and lower economic growth. So the fourth thing that I said just now is actually the economic trend in Russia. So the first one is the capital flight. In the first 3 quarters of the year, net private capital outflows from Russia total $85 billion compared to net outflows of $54 billion in all of 2012. In December 2014, Putin announced that one of the Russia's sovereign wealth funds, the National Welfare Fund, would be used to recapitalize Russian bank. Okay, so second is depreciation of the ruble. Capital flight from Russia contributed to downward pressure on the ruble, which depreciated against the dollar by more than 50% between July 2014 and early December 2014, even before the events unfolding on December 15 and 16. Russia's central bank spent $80 billion to support the ruble in 2014 before the most recent round of currency interventions. Okay, so the third one is the inflation. In November 2014, inflation in Russia increased to 9.1%, which is the faster acceleration since 2011 and well above the central bank's target rate of 5% to 6%. In addition to depreciation of the ruble, inflation has been caused by Russia's ban on certain agricultural imports from countries imposing sanctions, which has caused some food prices in Russia to rise dramatically. Okay, last but not least is the diminished growth prospect. In October 2014, the IMF downgraded its forecast for Russia's economic growth in 2014 from 1.3% to 0.2%. It projected that Russia's economy will only grow by 0.5% by 2015. Although the Russian government had initially been optimistic about its economic growth prospect, in early December 2014, the Bank of Russia forecasted that the economy could contract by 4.5% in 2015. Okay, so I will pass to the next presenter, which is Nurul Izzati, to explain more about the factors of the financial crisis in Russia 2014. Thank you.
Thank you, Marni. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh to my lecturer, Saharul Nizam, and my fellow friends. My name is Nur Izzati binti Muhazim. Would like to present about the factors of Russian financial crisis in 2014. The factors of Russian financial crisis in 2014 can be divided into two major factors. The first major factors of Russian financial crisis in 2014 is Ukraine crisis lead to international economic sanction. Russian decision to invade Ukraine in mid-2014 resulted in a series of economic sanctions on the country by the United States, Canada, the European Union, and the other countries. The Western sanction had cost the country 26.7 billion in 2014 and 80 billion in 2015. The value of the country foreign trade slumped approximately 30% during the first 2 months of 2015. Thus, the sanction had a significantly impact on the whole Russian economic situation, both directly and indirectly. Next, we move to the second factors of Russian financial crisis. The second factors of Russian financial crisis in 2014 is the fall of oil price and the consequent ruble crisis. Russian economy is heavily dependent on crude oil and natural gas. Between mid-2014 until early 2016, crude oil price have fallen from a height around $100 per barrel to $30 per barrel, cutting deep into the country's major sources of revenue. When the oil price was high, some United States producers started to explore new regions once considered unprofitable, which significantly increased United States production from 7 million to 9 million barrels a day. This increase in production reduced United States external demand, and as the international supply was not reduced, it led price to decrease. This deep slump in price had tremendous consequences, especially on the ruble price and federal budget. Oil price influenced the exchange rate mostly through the wealth effect and term of trade. When the oil price decreased, by default, the oil sale revenue decreased, and therefore there is less demand for the domestic currency and less inflow of foreign currency, which depreciate the exchange rate. Other than that, the political instability caused by Ukraine's situation also helped to devaluate the ruble due to the capital flight that occurred. That's all for the factor of Russian financial crisis in 2014. Next, I will pass to the next presenter, which is Tengku Nur Syafika.
Thank you, Izzati, for your explanation about factors. My name is Tengku Nur Syafika, and I will continue about impact crisis in Russia. So, the crisis will impact on the business and the people in the Russia. For the Russian business are having an impact on the condition of individual sectors of the economy and individual large companies. It generates losses in the import that depend on branches of the economy which sell mainly on the domestic market, such as the machine building industry. The high technology sectors are the most affected. Meanwhile, as servicing foreign debt has become more expensive in view of the cheapness of the ruble and Western financial sanctions, those companies that have little debt in foreign currency have found themselves in a privileged position. One of the most visible consequences of the weakness of the ruble has been that the dollar-denominated capitalization of many companies and banks has decreased dramatically. Other sectors of the Russian economy are also experiencing problems. This concern the aviation industry, the automotive industry, and the tourism sector. Moreover, as the ruble crashed, the listing of those Western companies that had major investments in Russia declined, which further affected Russia's attractiveness to investors. Okay, so another impact which people in Russia started to feel the economic downturn, especially in the form of rising inflation and a decrease in real wages, as Russia's financial reserves were shrinking and prices had increased much more than had been expected. The government was not able to adjust wages. Real incomes in November turned out to be lower than in November 2013, while unemployment remains low for the time being, and people in Russia are starting to fear for their jobs. Other than that, most of them had to stop buying things they could afford. Okay, next is the lesson for the crisis in Russia. Okay, Russia's economic outlook today is more positive and better than it was just a few years ago. Oil prices have rebounded. This is a key development given how much of the economy still depends on oil and gas, and depreciated ruble has made commodity exports more profitable and contributed to an agricultural sector. However, it has also made importing the sort of technical equipment that Russia needs to upgrade its economy more expensive. This equipment is essential for further growth. Russia will be unable to produce such equipment on its own without major investment, which is more difficult to obtain financing for under sanctions. Furthermore, one of the most important also to keep the banking sector in good condition. So, in 2014, crisis seemingly had few political consequences for Vladimir Putin, Russian president, or his government. No high-level officials were fired, social unrest has been minimal, and Putin's popularity has actually risen. The financial crisis had such different political effects because the Putin government learned and applied three key lessons from 1998 financial crisis. Okay, which are lesson 1, you can never have too many reserves or too little debt. Lesson 2, crisis management requires executive control and coordination. Lesson 3, blame foreigners. Okay, for example, falling world oil price, wary or cautious foreign investors, and Western sanctions all contributed to the ruble's collapse. Okay, that's all from me. I will pass to Fatini as the next presenter to present about the Mexican peso crisis.
Thank you, Fika. Now I'm Nur Fatini and I will present on the topic of Mexican peso crisis 1994. In the early 90s, the Mexican economy seemed healthy when inflation was being reduced to a single-digit level, and Mexico began to attract foreign investors that were pumping money into the account that made central bank accumulated billions of dollars in the reserves due to large capital inflow. However, in December 94, Mexican pesos devaluated against the US dollar from about 5.3 pesos per dollar to over 10 pesos per dollar. Prices in Mexico rose by 24% over the same 4 months, and by the end of 1995, Mexico's inflation had reached 52%. Mutual funds, which had invested in over 45 billion worth of Mexican assets in the several years leading up to the crisis, began liquidating their position in Mexico and other developing countries. Foreign investors not only fled Mexico but emerging markets in general, and the crisis led to financial contagion throughout other financial markets in Asia and Latin America. The impact of Mexico's crisis on the southern cone and Brazil became known as the tequila effect. There were many factors that caused this crisis to happen. First is through political assassination. Mexico's central bank blamed a series of political shocks in 1994 for the December devaluation. Besides the rebellion in the southern province of Chiapas, a much more severe political shock occurred when the ruling party's presidential candidate, Luis Donaldo Colosio, was assassinated on March 23rd. At the time, Colosio was considered the winner for election. His death heightened fears of political instability and set off a brief financial panic. The sharp drop in Mexico's international reserves from February to April 1994 reflects the loss of reserves as the government intervened heavily to maintain the value of the peso during this time of upheaval.
In about 4 weeks, Mexico lost nearly 11 billion in reserves. Now, moving on to the next factor, which is the Mexico's current account deficit, which ballooned from 6 billion in 1989 to 15 billion in 1991, and to more than 20 billion in the next 2 years. To some extent, the current account deficit was a favorable development, reflecting the capital inflow stimulated by Mexican policy reforms. However, the large size of the deficit led some observers to worry that the peso was becoming overvalued, a circumstance that could lead discourage exports, stimulate imports, and lead eventually to a crisis. At that time, Mexico had a crawling peg exchange rate system. Government intervention kept the exchange rate against the dollar within a narrow target band, but the upper limit of the band was raised slightly every day by a pre-announced amount, allowing for a gradual nominal depreciation known as the crawling peg of the peso. However, in real price-adjusted terms, the peso was appreciating, contributing to the ballooning current account deficit. Moving on to the last factor, which is peso devaluation. The overvalued peso in the early 90s caused three related problems for Mexico. First, it made Mexican exports less competitive in the US market compared with US domestic products or imports from the other newly industrializing countries. Second, the high peso combined with liberalized trade led to an unprecedented surge in Mexican imports of consumer goods in 1993 to 1994. Weak exports and surging imports together resulted in an enormous trade deficit that reached 29 billion, which is 8% of Mexico's gross domestic product (GDP) by 1994. Third, the rising peso made Mexican labor costs rise in dollar terms in 1991 to 1994, thus making Mexico a less attractive investment location for multinational corporations seeking sites for a low-wage, labor-intensive assembly operations. The devaluation of the peso, which considered Mexico's labor costs by about 40% in dollar terms from 1994 to 1995, was thus necessary for the success of Mexico's economic strategy for attracting direct foreign investment. Now I will pass to the next presenter, which is Dalini. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatini, for the explanations. Now we look into the impacts of the crisis. First, the devaluation of the peso and the strong rise of inflation resulted in an interest rate hike. Mexico banking system was already in a bad shape prior to the crisis. A majority of the bank debtors were unable to pay the higher interest rate, which led to a strong rise of the non-performing loan ratio. Banks were therefore unable to honor their foreign currency liabilities. Thousands of mortgages went into default as Mexican citizens struggled to keep pace with rising interest rates, resulting in widespread repossession of houses. Second, Mexico experienced extreme poverty skyrocketed as real wages plummeted and unemployment nearly doubled. Nominal wages were sustained, but real wages fell by 25 to 35% over the same year. Unemployment climbed to 7.4% in 1995 from its pre-crisis level of 3.9% in 1994. In the formal sector alone, over 1 million people lost their jobs and average real wages decreased by 13.5% throughout 1995. Overall household incomes plummeted by 30% in the same year. And last, it caused havoc in the Mexican economy and also negatively impacted the domestic capital markets of many other emerging economies, especially in Latin America, but also throughout the entire world. With the peso stronger than it ought to have been, domestic businesses and consumers began purchasing increasingly more imports, and Mexico began running a large trade deficit. Speculators began recognizing that the peso was artificially overvalued and led to speculative capital flight that further reinforced downward market pressure on the peso. What can we learn from this crisis? First, openness to international financial markets today impose an obligation of unfailing discipline on economic policy. Vigilance and discipline provide the most effective deterrent and defense against financial market setbacks. Mexico crisis demonstrated impressively the cost that can arise when a country lowers its guards and allows markets to exercise their discipline instead. Second, large external current account deficits are dangerous, especially when they are being used to support domestic consumption and are being financed by short-term capital inflows. They are dangerous because they are not likely to be sustainable. This applies even when, as in Mexico case, the fiscal position is strong and the external deficit largely reflects weak private sector saving. With the benefit of hindsight, Mexico's fiscal position should have been even stronger to contain the country's dependence on easily reversible capital inflows. And the last point, Mexico crisis illustrates the cost of failure to publish regularly and in good time information about key economic indicators. The crisis arose in way it did partly because the scale of the problem only became apparent at the time of the devaluation and took the financial markets by surprise. If information about international reserve and other key variables had been published more frequently and with a shorter time lag, the efficiency of market discipline and the chance of a smoother adjustment would clearly have been enhanced. That's all from us from Mexican Peso crisis, and for the next topic, I will pass to Nur Azlin to present.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Azli binti Peso. So today I would like to present the crisis about the Argentina Great Depression 1998 until 2002. So Argentina turbulent economy history. Argentina has a chronic economic, monetary and political problem. After achieving independence from the Spain War, that began in 1810, Argentina province fought among themselves for many years until the late 1800s. The province and the regional government often finance budget deficits by printing money. The result were persistent inflation and low economic growth. In the late of 1800s and early 1900s, the Argentina enjoy rapid economic growth. During the 1930s, when important trading partners discriminated against Argentina's export, Argentina's responded by beginning switch to import substitution, self-sufficient economy with high tariff and extensive government direction. The result was low growth and frequent inflation. Economic reforms of 1990s. In 1989, Carlos Menem became president. The centerpiece of Menem's policies was the convertibility law, which took effect on April 1, 1991. It ended the hyperinflation by establishing a pegged exchange rate with the US dollar and backed money issued by the central bank substantially with dollars. Argentina reform were faster and deeper than any country of the time outside of the former communicate bloc. Real GDP grew more than 10% in the year 1991 and 1992 before slowing to a more normal rate of slightly below 6% in 1993 and 1994.
Thank you, Azin, First of all, my name is Najwa. So this slide is a factor of the Argentina financial crisis. So first point is the lack of the flexibility, which is the first dimensions of the rigidity problems is an insufficient exposure of the Argentina economy to foreign trade, which is notwithstanding gains made directions of the regional economic integrations judging by the ratio of the import to the GDP. Argentina is one of the least exposed to international trade. The second issue is the labor regulations, and Argentina did not make enough progress to secure the much needed flexibility, and in particularly reallocations of the resources towards the tradable sectors face and additional restrictions. And this sector is essentially formal, while an important part of non-tradable activity is informal. Finally, the most notorious inflexibility occur in the public spending. Successful devaluations should reduce both labor costs and the burden of the states on the tradable activities. This is absence of the exchange rates flexibility in the situations called for the downward flexibility in the government spending or strict limits on the growth of the governments. And the second point is the political problems, which is in 2001, the banking system was further weakened by the governments that borrow compulsorily from bank reserve, which is the exchange rate regimes was reinformed by pegging the peso to the basket of the currencies that include the euro in an attempt to introduce some degree of the flexibility. Besides, the budget of the constraint were ignored both federal and the provincial government issue quasi the money, pensions and the retirement fund were interfered. These conductions, the credibility gap a few run bank deposits that lead to the compulsory freeze, default and devaluations. The third point is the external shock, which is the Argentina suffered an external blow of an unusual nature. The country traded intensively within the regions, exported agricultural, industrial commodity, and relied heavily on the capital inflows. From the 1997 onward, all of these factors fell behind, as the price dropped around 15% between 1996 to 1997 and 1999 to 2000. In addition, the country's situation worsens because its main trading partners such Euro, Brazil, Chile depreciate their currencies with peso pledged rigidly to the US dollar. There was no way to offset competitive depreciations, and the foreign credit gradually waned, and capital markets began to believe that the Argentine crisis by not transitory in the nature, and the problem of the external financial was partially cushioned during 2000 and 2001 by borrowing from the multilateral institutions, revealing that the turns around in the private flows was even worse. So I will pass back to the Azrin to explain more about the implications of the Argentina.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Nur Azli binti Isa. So today I would like to present about the implication of Argentina experience. So the implication of Argentina experience first is the policy on international financial crisis. Since the Mexican financial crisis of 1994, there have been similar crises in large emerging market countries almost every year, as well as crises in many smaller countries. Some of the crises have had repercussion in US financial markets since 1994. Neither the US government nor apparently any other government has articulated a comprehensive view about how to solve the crisis. The main issues involved in recent international financial crises are exchange rate regimes. The role of International Monetary Fund in resolving crisis and restructuring government and private sector debt. Such a view should not be set in stone. but it should reflect what officials think they have learned from the experience of the crisis since 1994 and should serve as a guide for future policy. Lacking clear views, the international community has in the last few years lacked consistency in its treatment of Argentina, which has contributed to erratic policy making by Argentina's government. Okay, second is US law foreign seizure of property. A number of actions of Duhil government have had the effect of seizing property or nullifying contract with US citizens and corporation. There are several US law on the books whose aim to discourage foreign government from taking such action. Then, this law have generally not been applied by successive administrations, nor has Congress pressed for their enforcement. Since the law that letters, an obvious question is whether their continued existence serve any purpose. The third is the importance of property to prosperity. The economic policies of the Duhil government has overturned property rights contracted with great effort over the previous decade or longer. In November 2001, Argentina was a country where contracts were generally enforced. Bank deposits were secure. People were free to buy to buy and sell the foreign money currency as they saw fit. By February 2002, Argentina had become a country where nobody could trust a contract, where the government had frozen bank deposit, people risk in risk imprisonment for buying and selling foreign currency at market rates of exchange, where property rights are insecure. Investing in the future become very risky, and economic activities focus on achieving short-term gains rather than making longer term investment that can be permanent improvement in productivity. Bringing long-term economic growth to Argentina will require respect for property rights rather than the frequent violation of them Argentina has seen during the last year and a half.
Thank you, Azin. So this is the last slide, which is the lesson on the crisis in the Argentina. The Argentina story underscores many of the lessons that we have learned from the previous crisis. It serves as another illustration of the complex dynamic interactions among the various sources that crises frequently involve, and a view of these interactions of how difficult it is to solve the crisis when it starts, and the facts that most of the usual indicators of the impending difficulties did not look alarming until the situations had declined to the point that there was no good exit disconcerting. The considerations emphasize that there remains considerable work to do on the crisis interventions and preventions. Besides, the Argentine crisis also have important lessons for the exchange rate regimes. It's not concluded that Argentina's currency board was a mistake from the start, and the currency board was critical in the taming hyperinflation when many other approaches had failed. And particularly given this year's success, it would have been extremely difficult political decisions to exit without any crisis. So that's all from us. Thank you.